Fantastic. We are glad to be back again for another episode of our Christian History Chronicles, and we are glad to have a repeat guest who is with us today, who's also participated in our podcast, Dr. Edwin Woodruff Tait. Thanks for joining us again. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that we are interested in talking about today is under a greater, bigger, maybe title of other reformations. I think anybody who begins to start to want to understand about Christian history and what's involved in that, certainly the Protestant Reformation as what would be the traditional, typical Luther, Zwingli, Calvin parts of that, I might just define as the bigger kind of traditional thing. And obviously there are a myriad of things internal from all of that to talk about. But outside of that, for our people to understand, hey, look, there were other reformations going on at different points in time within the church, are kind of part of what we'd like to be able to talk about today. So
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool, right? So
Yeah.
how do we start off with the idea of what is a reformation and who decides you're having one as compared to somebody who's just hacked off maybe and thinks, well, I got a better idea. I had a good cup of coffee this morning. I got some new ideas on my brain today. I think we ought to go this way instead of that way.
Yeah.
Maybe not so much a full reformation, right?
Well, the term Reformation, one of the ways it's used most commonly in the late Middle Ages, and I think it's very important for the Protestant Reformation, is within medieval monastic orders or religious orders. So particularly the orders like the Benedictines to begin with, your basic, Western monks, right, that start back in the 6th century. By the 10th, 11th century, a lot of people were like, we've gotten away from our goals, our original ideals, right? So we need to have a reformatio, a reforming, going back to the rule, practicing it more strictly. And already by the 11th, 12th centuries, you had different ideas of what that looked like. You had the Cluniac order, where their idea was we're going to spend all of our time in church chanting, and we're going to have peasants to work the land for us. That's Reformation, right?
Okay.
Then you have the Cistercians who are like the opposite. No, we're going to go out into the frontier parts of Europe that have been laid waste and just gone to forest, and we're going to chop down the forests and build water mills and build monasteries with our own hands and spend a lot of our time doing manual labor. That's what it means. And at the same time, then you have these monastic movements become this movement in the church of Reformatio that's led eventually by popes, Pope Gregory, where their idea of Reformation is to have the church the popes have a much stronger role in the church and in society, right? So a lot of what's going on in the 16th century with the Protestants is actually rolling some of that back, saying, wait a minute, what people said in the 11th century was a Reformation, that was the wrong path. Now the popes are way too powerful, right? So you're absolutely right. One person's reformatio is another person's deformatio, which is deformation. That's a term that they will use. And so throughout the later Middle Ages, you have these movements constantly to try to, especially within these religious orders that grow up, to try to reform them. And Luther was himself a member of what was called the observant branch of the Augustinian order. The Augustinian order itself was this kind of interesting thing that they just went back to St. Augustine's writings. Like, he wrote some stuff about how monks and nuns should live, so we're going to start a new order based on that, right? Then within that, as within other groups like the Dominicans, the Franciscans, there were people who said by the 15th century, we got too wealthy, we got too corrupt, we are not following our, this rule, in their case came from St. Augustine, supposedly. And so they had what were called the observant movements, which were reformed versions of these different orders. And Luther, that was his formation. He chose to join the strict guys, the observant guys, who were already, they thought they were the ones doing the reforming, right? Reformation for them was practice monasticism really strictly, really zealously. And what Luther finds, of course, the sort of starting point for him is he does all of this and he doesn't feel spiritually at peace. He comes to believe this is just a kind of false legalistic path.
Sure.
And Luther actually says at one point, I think it's his sermons on the Sermon on the Mount, God allowed the monks to become corrupt because that way we could see monasticism was a bad idea from the beginning. So he was like, if monasticism had stayed the way it was in the time of Saint Jerome, you know, who we were talking about the Vulgate, right, back in the 4th century, when they were very zealous and they were very committed, people would never have seen through it, right? So Luther isn't, you know, Luther in some ways we talk about him like he's the most conservative of the reformers, but in other ways he's the most radical
Mm.
because he doesn't actually use in his mature work the word reformatio very much about what he's doing. Heiko Obermann made this point in his book on Luther, Man Between God and the Devil. Luther thinks the end of the world is coming and God is graciously giving us a clearer view of the gospel, which we've lost for a long time. And yes, you could call that Reformation, but Luther wanted to distinguish what he saw as the recovery of the gospel from all the things other people were doing that, as he saw it, were just kind of trying to clean, you know, just kind of clean things up, to give a paint job to what he saw as more fundamental problems. And
Hmm.
so there were earlier medieval figures that Protestants will often look to as the forerunners, you know, people like Wycliffe and Huss.
Right.
And Luther, I mean, Luther admired Huss, and that was his big kind of break with church authority when Eck said, "You're agreeing with Huss." And Luther's like, "Well, so what? You know, Huss is right about some stuff." But he came to believe that Wycliffe and Huss even had not really gotten the main point because they did not teach justification by faith the way he did. They were reformers, in a sense, as he saw it. They were trying to get a more morally rigorous church, a church that was practicing traditional doctrines better. And Luther had his view of salvation was the most radical of anybody's in the 16th century. And what a lot of the other groups were doing is they were, in a sense, more interested in moral reform, structural reform, social reform than Luther was. So that's one of the basic, you have Luther's kind of ideas about salvation over here, and then you have these kind of broader, many different movements that have these more common ideas. We need a purer church, we need better teaching, we need more adherence to scripture, we need, you know, simpler worship that more instructs people rather than just being a lot of ritual, all of these ideas over here. And then
Mm.
Luther's like, but fundamentally it's about how you're saved. And
Mm.
those things interacted in some very complex ways to create what we now know as Protestantism. And then, of course, there were people within the Catholic Church who might or might not be sympathetic with Luther, but remained loyal to the church, but were still on board with a lot of these other kinds of reform that they thought needed to happen.
Well, where did they go? How were they able to exercise those ideas that they had that, yeah, I think Luther's right on a lot of points. Let's just say point A, B, or C, whatever it
Yeah.
may be. And then how did that take off, or did
Yeah.
it?
Well, there were sort of there's within the Catholic Church, the sort of Catholic Reformation, it really had kind of two wings, and it wasn't always a simple relationship. But basically, there were those who, and these were the ones who wound up winning with the Council of Trent, more or less, who thought, you know, Protestantism was just wrong. So for them, Reformation was about reaffirming all the doctrines and the liturgical practices, but doing it better. And that's what the Council of Trent was trying to do, right? That we talked about last
Mhm.
time, having
Right.
clearer authority structures, more education for priests, more, you know, making sure priests were actually leading good lives and being good examples and not doing corrupt stuff, having more authority for bishops. You know, that was their idea of Reformation, right?
It was
And
a
then there were these,
reminder. I'm
I'm
sorry,
sorry.
I don't
Yeah.
interrupt you, but
No, go ahead.
it was more like a instead of a reform in my mind. Reform means we got to do it different.
Okay.
This is more of a reminder, right? Hey, let's get back to the things that we know, and I think we've moved away from that, and we
Yeah.
all kind of recognize that. So we're gonna remind everyone that we need to get back to what are our core basic things
Yeah,
that we
I mean,
believe
I
in
think
as
it's
compared to
interesting that to
overhauling it.
you that's
Yeah.
not reform because I think again in this kind of medieval usage, that's exactly what reform was supposed to be. Was, you know, not really changing things so much as going back and saying, "Oh, wait a minute, we're not practicing what's down here in the rule," right?
Right. Okay.
The thing with Protestantism was that the Protestants went, you know, for them, obviously, the rule was the Bible. As for all Christians, it is in some sense, right? You know, in
Mhm.
some very important sense, the Bible is central to all Christians, not just Protestants. But the Protestants, of course, emphasize the authority of the Bible over the church. So they go back to the Bible as they're studying it, and they say, you know, there's some fairly radical things that need to be changed to get back.
Right.
So I would say there's always reform or reformation is a very broad term,
Mhm.
and it can and the further back you think you're going, the more you're actually changing. You know, so in a sense, the further back you go, the more radical you are, and the more, in a sense, you're actually going to be going into the future, if that makes sense. Like if you,
Okay.
if you could go back to 50 years ago, like now in the Catholic Church, we got these people who want to kind of go back to the way things were before Vatican II. That's barely, there's people who can still remember that. So while there's still a lot of romanticization, and what they wind up recovering isn't exactly like what was there in the 50s, there's people who remember the 50s, right? So you can still kind of have a model to go back to. If you're going back 500 years, it's a bit harder, right? If you're going back 1,000 years, you're going back 2,000 years to the New Testament. Of course, the thing that Catholics always criticize Protestants for is they let the cat out of the bag. And for 500 years now, every so often, a group of Protestants says, wait a minute, I went back to the Bible and I found something different than the last group of people did. Here's something new I've seen.
Right.
And what we see in the Bible, is always going to be shaped by our own times. And I think this is the point many Protestants, don't see. Like, there's a quote that there's an interview John Piper, Tim Keller, some other people did, I don't know, back in 2017, I think it was, for the anniversary of the Reformation. And Piper has this quote that summarizes a kind of Protestant view that I strongly disagree with, but Piper always puts things very well. So he's a good guy to disagree with because he's always very clear. And he says, basically, people just started reading the Bible. They hadn't read the Bible. They started reading the Bible. And when they read the Bible, they saw these things, that were Protestantism. But the thing is, medieval, for all that sometimes lay people didn't have a lot of direct access to the Bible, medieval church people were reading and studying the Bible intensely, constantly. And that's just sort of an outdated idea that nobody who really studies the subject now actually thinks. I mean, Piper's a bright guy, but he's not primarily a historian of the Middle Ages. And so, when you study late medieval biblical interpretation, you realize how obsessed with the Bible these guys were. They were studying it. But then then you have the Renaissance, right? The biblical humanist movement, people like Erasmus, and people start looking at the Bible in a different way, with a different cultural lens, and they see new things there. And so part of the tension over what kind of Reformation do we want is, what are our cultural lenses? Which things do we emphasize in our common faith? And therefore, which things need to be changed? And that's where all the dissension comes, Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
But you were asked about the Catholic Reformation. I got off.
Yeah. No, please go ahead.
So there were the people who wanted to kind of double down, and then there was this movement that were often called the evangelicals within the Catholic Church, who had a basic level of sympathy with Luther's core point about salvation. So one of my favorite guys has got the Venetian diplomat called Gasparo Contarini, and he had something that sounds almost more like a typical evangelical conversion experience almost than Luther did. Because when Luther talks about his breakthrough, his big moment, for one thing, it's kind of hard to pin down when it really happened, and he may be kind of conflating a bunch of stuff. And it was very theological, it was very intellectual. Contarini goes to confession, so it's very Catholic, right? He goes to confession in Holy Week. And when the priest pronounces absolution over him, he just has this moment where he's like, wow, God just forgave my sins. And he forgave my sins because of Jesus. And my sins are forgiven. This is amazing, And he goes out and it transforms him. And he's this aristocrat and this diplomat, this government official, but he becomes devoted to the Christian faith and to following Christ because of this moment where he has this overwhelming sense of God's sheer grace. And this seems to be sort of independent of anything Luther was saying, And so when Luther comes along, Contarini's like, that kind of sounds familiar. He's not completely wrong. And so he is one of a group of people that Pope Paul III appoints as cardinals in 1537. So this is, at this point, 95 Theses are 20 years in the past now. Protestantism is well on the way to becoming something separate. But they're trying, there's all this debate that we talked about in our last conversation about trying to call the Council of Trent, trying to call a council. The popes don't really want to call a council. The emperor wants a council. There's all this diplomacy. And Pope Paul III comes, and he's kind of corrupt, like they all are a bit, he does nepotism, but he's not super corrupt. He's kind of moderately corrupt, Pope, and he has at least some good intentions. And he says, we really do need to reform, and we really do need to call a council. And so he makes some changes. And one of them is that he finally does call the council, but another is he appoints this group of cardinals, right? So these are the guys who elect the next pope, but they also help run the church, right? And And he picks people who are really serious about the faith. He picks a group of new cardinals that he thinks are really going to bring about reform. One of them's Contarini. It actually causes some trouble because they're so serious about their pastoral responsibilities. One of them, Jacopo Sadaletto, who wound up getting an argument with Calvin, very famous debate with Calvin. He goes off to his diocese in the mountains. It was actually across from Geneva, which is why he winds up tangling with Calvin in the Alps. And he's like, he won't come to Rome to help the Pope run the church because he says, no, I'm a bishop. I got to be here taking care of my people and writing books. He liked to write books. You know, that was kind of an excuse partly. He was a scholar. And the Pope has to like threaten him, like, come back to Rome. Because part of the problem is you got all these bishops who are basically hanging out in Rome trying to advance their careers. They're not caring for their people. That's one of the things that all the reformers agreed needed to be changed. You need pastors who are real pastors, right? Who really live with their people. What Pope Francis would say, having the smell of the sheep on you. So Contarini, there's this guy Sadaletto, another guy, there's several of these guys that are somewhat sympathetic with Protestantism. And then there's another group, like Carafa, who winds up becoming Pope later, who are much more in that other camp. So there's a division within them. There's some that are more sympathetic, some that are more, nope, Protestantism's evil, got to just stamp it out. They disagree on that, but they agree on the need for moral reform and for spiritual reform, right? And they produce this Concilium de Emendanda Ecclesia, this recommendation for reform that's, fairly radical. It basically says the Pope's the source of a lot of the problems. We've got to change how the Pope does business. We've got to change how the Curia, the papal court does business. A lot of it's never really fully implemented. But that's a moment of real hope, and even some of the more moderate Protestants are saying, wait, there's people in Rome we can actually talk to. They're maybe not all just full of Satan, maybe there's some real Christians now in Rome, and so for people who really want unity, it's kind of the last gleam of hope is that late 1530s. And then in 1541, there is this dialogue at Regensburg where Contarini is not actually engaged in the dialogue. He's the papal representative behind the scenes to make sure the Catholic representatives don't give away too much. But again, you got a guy representing the Pope, being the doctrinal watchdog, who kind of thinks Luther's partly right about justification. And they reach this famous agreement on justification by faith called double justification that says you're justified by faith. You also need to have good works, but at the end of the day, your works are never going to be enough. So you still have to go back to trusting in the mercy of Christ. It's fairly similar in some ways to a Wesleyan understanding that I grew up with. And in the end, Luther doesn't like it, and the Council of Trent rejects it, so it doesn't go anywhere. But it also falls apart, and this is partly why I'm telling the story, because Contarini, while he's sympathetic to the Protestants on justification, he's not so sympathetic to them on the Eucharist. And this is one of the issues that Protestants don't always get. In the early years of the Reformation, the big issue for Protestants was justification by faith. But the big issue for Catholics was the Eucharist. They were very concerned about any compromise of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Mm-hmm. And so the early Catholic opponents of Luther, there's a book by David Bagshey about this. It's really good. The early guys writing against Luther, they're not really clear whether he's actually heretical about salvation, because there isn't a defined doctrine like there was at Trent about the relationship between faith and works. There's still room at that point, right? For some, we're not really sure how, we know justification by faith is a thing. It's there in Paul. It's just a question of what does it mean? How does it relate to the good works we all agree good Christians should be doing, right? What's exactly the relationship here? There's still room for some dialogue about that. But they're very worried because they think he's attacking the sacraments. And the irony, of course, is Luther doesn't attack the sacrament. Like, he's way more conservative on the sacraments than people like Zwingli, right? He's the most radical on salvation, but he's the most conservative on the sacraments. So then when Zwingli and all these other guys come along, then they really freak out, And so at Regensburg, Contarini's like, we got to use the word transubstantiation. And it's mostly because he wants to make sure and exclude the people who really don't believe that Christ's body is genuinely present in the Eucharist. And so the whole thing breaks down. So this is a kind of Catholic Reformation that sort of could have happened. Mm-hmm. Where we're open to dialogue on justification, but we got to keep the traditional doctrines on the sacraments. That doesn't happen. I mean, the closest you get to it probably is something like Anglicanism today. With the way Anglicanism later developed, it kind of wound up kind of there. Range of beliefs on salvation, fairly traditional sacramental practice. But that's one possible path. And then eventually after the Council of Trent, a lot of these guys, Contarini dies during the council, but a lot of the surviving members of that quote, evangelical group are persecuted or at least kind of discredited. One of them was a guy called Reginald Pole, who was an English aristocrat. In fact, Henry VIII killed a lot of his family while, fortunately, Pole was abroad. And he nearly became pope. There was one vote. He nearly became pope. And
Wow.
the Carafa, who was one of these other reformers, but was one of the more anti-Protestant ones, said, this guy's practically a Protestant. We got to stop him. And gets the coalition together. I don't know if Carafa was elected that time or if it was later, but eventually he becomes the Pope, and Pole never does. But again, that's a sort of, it nearly happened. There nearly was a Pope whose doctrine of justification, again, is kind of sympathetic to the Protestant one. The thing is, though, then after he fails to become Pope, he winds up back in England with Queen Mary persecuting Protestants, right? So it's complicated. It's not like these guys were all warm and fuzzy. You know, they thought the Protestants were splitting the church and that was bad. And the common inspiration for a lot of these people was Erasmus, who is someone I wanted to make sure we talked about.
Sure.
Because when I talk about a kind of a Reformation that might have looked different, it would have been one that was more thoroughly inspired by Erasmus. So I don't know. I mean, I've been rattling on for a while, so I want to give you a chance.
No. I think so. Let's just say though, for those of us that might not know.
Yeah.
Okay. So reforming what we should do, what we should not do, whatever all those components are. The Council of Trent happens, right?
Yeah.
So after the council, what is it? 12 years, 13 years?
17 years, actually.
17, okay, yeah. What about reform after that? What does other reform? Who dings the bell again that it raises enough interest to say, we got to go back and recheck that again?
So you're talking about within the Catholic Church?
Yeah, I mean, particularly within the Catholic Church.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting point because there's a stereotype that I myself used to have, even when I was in grad school, and honestly, I should have known better, that kind of the Catholic Church didn't change a whole lot, over the centuries between Trent, and Vatican II, or at least maybe the 19th century and the French Revolution.
Okay.
And I am learning that's wrong. There's a book, and I still haven't actually read the book, which I should have. But there's a scholar called Ulrich Lehner, who's a really good Catholic scholar. And in fact, we corresponded some years ago, maybe working together on a collection of readings of early modern Catholicism. It never went anywhere. He's written about the Catholic Enlightenment, for instance, and that, we tend to think of the Enlightenment as a movement that was, to some extent anti-Christian and certainly anti-Catholic. Against priestcraft, against tradition. It's very much about reason. And he's made the point that a lot of the people driving the Enlightenment were Catholic clergy and religious people. And there was a Catholic Enlightenment that kind of changed Catholicism. We tend to kind of forget about it because after the French Revolution, there was this other kind of movement, more conservative movement again in Catholicism. And that's what we tend to think of. So my picture was you got Trent, you got Vatican II, and in between, it's kind of, no, we got to hold the line, not change, right? Well, they can say that, but no religious tradition can go for what, 5 years, 10 years without changing? Right. I mean, you know that, right? We've all seen changes in our lifetimes. In every church you can think of. It's not what it was 20 years ago, even. It just life is change, right? And so, the big Protestant fallacy is thinking you can just go back to the Bible and just read the Bible simply and reconstruct things. The big Catholic fallacy or Orthodox fallacy is to think you can just have the unchanging faith. I mean, you want certain things not to change, but you can never have a faith that doesn't change at all. It's just a fallacy. And so yes, there are. I mean, after the Council of Trent, for one thing, a lot of the things that happened after the Council of Trent weren't actually called for by the council. John O'Malley, who was a great Jesuit scholar of this stuff, made this point. And so he makes the point, for instance, we tend to think of the post-Tridentine church, the post-Reformation church, as this church where the Pope was way stronger and much more in control. That was not something Trent ever called for. Trent did not really say much about the Pope at all. Trent was very interested in the authority of the local bishops and exalting their authority so they could have complete control over what went on inside their diocese. Doesn't say much about the papacy. But in practice, after the Council of Trent, the papacy became much more kind of dominant within the church, and the challenges to the papacy that had happened in the 15th century kind of go away, because they're now seen that's now seen as Protestantism, right? Being loyal to the Pope is kind of the sign that you're a good Catholic. So in practice, you have this very strong papal movement. You have this explosion in the late 16th, 17th centuries of religious orders, where particularly women's religious orders. There's just growth in women's piety. And there are no longer, they don't have the kind of public role that women's groups had had in the Middle Ages sometimes. They're relegated mostly to kind of, except for Teresa of Avila, who's a doctor of the church, but most of them are doing things like nursing and education. But you have this, so there's all kinds of, there's in the 17th century, there's of course the Jansenist movement, which was a kind of sort of Calvinist-like movement within Catholicism. In fact, one of the things many Protestants don't know about is the Catholics had a huge debate about predestination at the turn of the 17th century, just before the Calvinist-Arminian controversy broke out. And it actually influenced it. So Arminius was reading Molina, who was the Jesuit dude, the kind of Arminian equivalent in Catholicism. And that's one of the things his enemies got him for. Like, you're reading this papist over here, And he's like, yeah, but you guys agree with, Thomas Aquinas, So, I mean, you're all, they were each matching up to some extent with, it was a somewhat different debate, but there was a similar debate over predestination. It's actually one of the examples where you do see the use of the papacy, because the Pope just said, y'all, you're both Orthodox, stop calling each other heretics. You can have different views about predestination and stay in the same church. And it's one of the ways in which Catholicism is more inclusive historically, whereas in Protestantism, predestination tends to create splits. In Catholicism, that has been ever since something. Nowadays, most Catholics are de facto what Protestants would call Arminians. But theoretically, like, most of the great Catholic theologians believed in predestination in ways a little bit different from Calvin, but not as different as people think, Aquinas, Augustine. So there was that debate. There was, and then you have the Jansenists who then take the predestination idea much further, and they get condemned as being too close to Calvinism. You have these mystical movements. You have the Quietists, if you've heard of people like Madame Guyon, who were seen as unorthodox, especially in France. There was a lot of ferment in the 17th century. There was, so there were movements towards reform. They didn't maybe always call themselves that, because you don't want to sound like you're a Protestant, You don't want to admit there's anything that could be changed about the Catholic Church, because then you're a Protestant. You got to maintain this rhetoric of, we are faithful to the one faith the way it's always been, right? But in practice, again, you can't not change. And then you have the Enlightenment. And then finally in the 19th century, the influence of Romanticism and this more within Catholicism kind of organic, mystical way of thinking about the church and about the faith that eventually will help lead to Vatican II, to the 20th century, to these, where you really have reform in the Catholic Church finally in the 20th century, where you have these movements to actually go back to the Bible in the early church. So very similar, I would argue, to what people like Erasmus were trying to do in the 16th century. And that leads it then into Vatican II, and we're going to do a Christian history issue about that coming out. So,
fantastic.
About Vatican II. So stay tuned for that.
Well, it all kind of boils down into a way that I usually kind of make a quip whenever I'm in the classroom or talking to somebody else. Jesus didn't give us a 3-ring binder, right? Or at either at the upper room or anywhere else after that. Said, this is exactly the way you're going to do it, right? Follow this. It's a lot easier just to know, thou shalt not do these things and thou shalt do these things. It's not too hard. Sometimes it might be hard to follow, but it's not hard to comprehend. Okay.
I think we also want these shortcuts. We want to have this way that we can have a formula that will sort of give us the right answers. And again, I think both Protestants and Catholics do this in different ways. Protestants, it's usually, if you just have the right way of reading the Bible, if you finally figure out the right way to read the Bible, you'll get all the right answers, and we keep, it doesn't seem to me that works. But Catholics are always like, oh, if we just follow the church. And that's, right now, it's really healthy for Catholics that there's been this kind of whiplash right now where everyone thought the church was becoming more conservative, and then Pope Francis comes along and kind of pulls it back the other way, and suddenly, oh, wait a minute, who's with the Pope now? It's kind of healthy, because it ideally should make us be humbler about our own vision of the faith. It doesn't often, unfortunately, but it should, and more willing to listen to each other. Say,
it gives us the Holy Spirit, right? And so, that's the thing, and that kind of might be a little bit too woo-woo for some people to understand and to comprehend. So that's another story for another day that we will.
Well, I think where the Holy Spirit ceases to be woo-woo is if I can listen to the Holy Spirit through the mouth of someone I disagree with. through someone to whom I am bound together in the Christian faith, but I don't necessarily find congenial. So if I said earlier, somebody like John Piper, is someone that is so easy to beat up on if you don't like his theology, but, those of us who don't agree with his theology need to listen to it, and also people you might think are more liberal than you, or, whatever. I mean, this is, I guess very Catholic of me in a way, but, I believe very strongly in sort of the incarnational nature of the church. And I think the Holy Spirit is not just like a set of feelings in your heart. The Holy Spirit is the bond, what, the church is historically called the bond of charity, the love of God personified. The Holy Spirit is a person, and that person is at least in some theologies, the love of God, who binds us together. So, you look in the face of your brother or sister and you see Christ there, and that's the Holy Spirit doing that. I'm sorry.
There you go. Wow. A lot of great stuff. I mean, a lot of good things to be able to kick around and talk about. Anything in particular we didn't cover that you think that we ought to talk about? Okay.
One of the things I wanted when I set this up to talk about is the so-called radical Reformation.
Okay.
Because, we talk a lot about Catholic movements. The other kind of side of it, right, if we're kind of skipping over the so-called magisterial Reformation, is the people who, basically the radical Reformation are people who don't manage to get governments to agree with them. That's really what makes you a radical, right? What we think of as the mainstream Reformation, those are the people who got some rulers, at least, to sign on to their vision. That's why it's called the magisterial Reformation, magistrate, the government officials. It's the Reformation that gets the support of governments, right? The Lutheran movement, the Reformed movement. And then Anglicanism wasn't really a separate thing at that point. It was, but, those groups. And then you have these other people, and most typically, we think of them as the Anabaptists, right? And one of the key things that made it hard to get governments to support you was if you didn't believe in infant baptism, because infant baptism was what kind of made society Christian, right? So if that's kind of, for a ruler's perspective, that's one of the reasons you have a church at all, is it gives unity, because everyone's baptized. You're having a fight, you could say, hey, you're baptized too, So this idea of a kind of voluntary community of believers, governments aren't too keen on that idea. And that's the Anabaptists get persecuted by everybody. But the thing with the Anabaptists is they get described as the radicals. But my advisor, David Steinmetz, made this point, and I've said that kind of this a couple times today. When it comes to salvation, Luther's the radical. When it comes to salvation, what the Christian life looks like, in some ways, the Anabaptists look very traditional. They look a lot like these late medieval monastic reformers. And there's actually a theory that says, that really they're almost, you could see them as almost a kind of monastic movement. In fact, the way they function, if you think about Protestantism, Mennonites, Amish, they function kind of within Protestantism the way religious orders function in Catholicism. There are people who live this more disciplined, more intense version of the faith and kind of are a witness to everybody else, and you even have the Hutterites, who live communally. And so, they're very much like a monastic group in some ways. And the other thing is a lot of the radicals were very influenced by Erasmus. And I keep, it's the other thing I wanted to I said I wanted to make sure to talk about Erasmus because he's this incredible scholar who has this understanding of what Reformation looks like that is mostly following the example of Jesus and following the Sermon on the Mount and taking the teachings of Jesus more seriously and basing Christian faith around what he called the philosophy of Christ, by which he meant basically living the way Jesus wants us to live, living the way Jesus lived. Nonviolence was very important for him, not seeking great wealth and power. And he tried to educate rulers this way. God bless him. He and Thomas More, they teamed up. They tried to turn Henry VIII into an ideal Christian ruler. And they wound up accidentally creating Anglicanism, and Thomas More got killed, for not going along with that, so it kind of blew up in their faces. But, they really thought Henry VIII was going to be the perfect Christian prince at one point. God bless him, so they wanted to influence the powerful. They were elitists, actually. But the irony is, in some ways, Erasmus's ideas got most implemented by the so-called radicals, by the Anabaptists, who formed these communities. One of my favorite Erasmus quotes is, "What is a city but a great monastery?" He wanted entire cities of people who were dedicated to disciplined Christian living. What he got was, and that's kind of what Calvin was trying to do in Geneva, by the way, and in Catholicism, St. Charles Borromeo was trying to do in Milan. There were attempts to do that on the city level. But, it's hard to get a whole city of people following Jesus, right? So what you wind up with is these little communities of persecuted people who are actually really inspired by this elitist Catholic intellectual, who says ultimately the Christian life is about trying to live like Jesus. And so for people like Erasmus, one of the main problems with Christianity as he saw it that needed reform was war. He thought it was appalling that Christians fought wars against each other. And it wasn't even great that they fought wars with Muslims. He was like, you know what? We conquer the Turks. What are we going to do? We're not in any shape to convert them to Christianity. I mean, he reluctantly eventually was like, okay, if they're actually invading us, yeah, fine. War and self-defense might be okay. But he was so not quite a pacifist, but in his early writings, he sounded like one. And because he was very strong on to follow Jesus means to be nonviolent. Well, who winds up practicing that? It's the Mennonites, right? So for me, that's when I talk about sort of other reformations of the path not taken. That's one of the things that intrigues me is there was this whole anti-war movement in the early 16th century. There was this movement that was very much about having a simpler Christianity that was nonviolent and that didn't, that sort of frowned on the acquisition of great wealth, and that was about forming a genuine Christian community of people who loved each other. Which sounds to us just very kind of touchy-feely, but it was a real ideal that people were working for. And the Protestant reformers agreed with a lot of that. They were all down on, rulers just going out and waging war for their own glory, which was accepted culturally. It was like, oh yeah, one of the things you do as a king, you fight a war, it makes you glorious. And all the reformers said, no, sorry. All the reformers, Protestant, Catholic, agreed that the trend where rich people were buying up poor people's land and what's called enclosure and putting all the common land that belonged to the village, they were privatizing it, and they were creating these massive estates and putting fences around them. In England, Thomas More, devout Catholic, dies as a martyr of the Catholic Church, denounces it. Tyndale, Latimer, martyrs for Protestantism, they denounce it. They agree on that stuff.
Mm.
And the part of me that really, cares about social justice, which is increasingly stronger, Brett says, wouldn't have been great if those guys could have got together. And what happens is these theological disputes, which I don't want to dismiss. I mean, obviously talking about how we're saved, the nature of the sacraments, let's say these are not important things. But those things come to be seen as the defining questions, right? In the mainstream Reformation. And that divides people who on a kind of moral and spiritual level were very similar. C.S. Lewis, when he wrote his history of English language, English literature in the 16th century, he read every book written in the 16th century in English, by the way. It was just amazing. He took like 20 years to do that, like 17 years to write this book, because he went to the Oxford Library, Bodleian Library, and just read everything. And he, at least everything he could find. But one of the things, so he read everything by William Tyndale and everything by Thomas More. And a lot of their writings are writing against each other. They each thought the other one was basically evil. But he's like, I read them and they're both really holy people. They really love Jesus, and yet they're bitterly opposed to each other. What would it have been if Tyndale and More could have teamed up, instead of Henry VIII essentially hijacking Protestantism, bits of Protestantism that he happened to like, for his own worldly ends, and then of course the Catholics on the other hand, what do they do? Well, how do they get support? They give the rulers more power. They become the church that supports the aristocrats and the absolute monarchies, because that's how they get support over against the Protestants.
Sure.
And in the end, the theological division, as I see it, really gives the emerging secular state the upper hand over against any kind of Christian church. It's harder to be a powerful witness when you're constantly trying to get the government to support you against those other Christians over there you don't like. And that for me is part of the great tragedy of the Reformation. Whatever you think the Reformation gained, you have this division among people who clearly care about following Jesus. So that's my.
How about that? Well, and if it was all cut and dried and done, we wouldn't have 31 flavors at Baskin Robbins, would we? So I mean,
exactly.
that's how that.
Yeah, we talk about how capitalism plays into that.
That's right. Thank you so much for your time today.
No, it's always good talking to you.
Able to speak with you, and every single time that we've been around each other whatsoever, I'm always the guy that walks away learning a heck of a lot more than I knew before I started. So that's enjoyable as well too. We hope everyone has enjoyed our Christian History Chronicles. Don't forget, at our webpage. You can go back at the Center for ChristianHistory.com and be able to sign up for our updates, and also to be able to find a way to connect to our podcast, which is This Week in Christian History. So you'll be able to find those primarily on iTunes and on Spotify. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's been good.